Oh, what's that smell? Oh my god. One of the darkest stories to come out of Australia. One of the worst serial killings in Australian history. But it wasn't just one serial killer, and these killings weren't random. Join me today while I tell you about the Snowtown murders, also known as the Bodies in the Barrel murders. G'day there everyone, welcome to Bedtime Crime, a channel dedicated to serial killers, murder stories, and much more. So please remember to like and subscribe to help the channel. Let's get into today's story. This is one of the most draining stories I've ever had to research. There was a lot of conflicting reports and evidence from source to source. However, I have tried my best to be as accurate as possible. Our story will eventually take us to the small town of Snowtown. However, let's start where it all began. Another small suburb just outside of Brisbane, Australia called Inala. I actually used to live very close to Inala. But this story starts in 1966, long before I was born. On September 4th, 1966, John Justin Bunting was born, the only child to parents Tom and Jan Bunting. When Bunting was around 8 years old, he was sexually assaulted at the age of 8 by a friend's older brother. It's possible that because of this experience, he built up a strong, violent hatred towards pedophiles and homosexuals. A hatred that would become an obsession. He turned into a young man with a fascination of photography, weaponry, and anatomy. He had a small stint working for a crematorium, but was later let go, and then started working for an abattoir around the age of 22. His time at the abattoir seemed to be something he really enjoyed. However, not in the way most people would enjoy their jobs. Reports say he would often brag about getting to slaughter animals and the enjoyment he would get out of doing it. These weren't just any animals at the abattoir. These were dogs and cats that he would also gather. Though he may have already developed a dark side at a young age, people around him said he was kind and compassionate. He had good people skills and was good at making friends, as well as making people feel included. Good personality traits as they were, not all people use them for good. In fact, these traits are also common in cult leaders. In 1989, Bunting would meet Veronica Tripp, and not too long after, the two would get married. In 1991, Bunting and Tripp would move to 203 Waterloo Corner, Salisbury, Adelaide in South Australia. Here is where Bunting would meet couple Robert Joe Wagner and Barry Lane. However, Barry Lane is not who Bunting would normally associate with. Lane was an open homosexual and crossdresser, a minority that Bunting despised. Wagner was also a troubled child as well. He grew up in an abusive household and struggled in school. Along the way, in his very early teens, he would meet Lane and they would start a relationship. The relationship started when Wagner was only 13. It seemed that Bunting's hatred for homosexuals and pedophiles increasingly grew over the months and years. In 1992, Clinton Trezise, 22, moved into the neighbourhood not too far from Bunting, Wagner and Lane. Wagner and Lane would introduce themselves to Trezise and would befriend him. They would introduce Trezise to Bunting. And in August 1992, Bunting would invite Trezise over to his house. Reports suggest that there was a conflict when Bunting accused Trezise of crimes against children. Bunting left the lounge room for a moment, and when Trezise wasn't looking, Bunting hit Trezise in the back of the head with a shovel and started bashing him with it. Trezise would die from the injuries. There was also no evidence that Trezise was a pedophile. However, Bunting also classified homosexuals to be on the same level as pedophiles. This could have just been his way of trying to convince himself that it was okay to kill. Later, Bunting called Wagner and Lane over to his house. Both Wagner and Lane agreed to help with the disposal of Trezise. They dig a shallow grave on a farm in Lower Light about an hour out of Adelaide. Trezise's body would be found in 1994. Also in 1994, while Bunting was still married to Tripp, he had met and started having a relationship with Elizabeth Harvey. Elizabeth Harvey had 2 sons from her previous marriages, Troy Ude and James Flasakis. Ude and Flasakis were also boys who had an unfortunate, terrible upbringing. Ude and Flasakis were both sexually abused by Flasakis' biological father, and later, Ude, the older of the two, would go on to sexually abuse Flasakis. Later on, Elizabeth Harvey and her sons would move in with Bunting, and Flasakis, around 14 at the time, would look up to Bunting as another father figure. Flasakis would idolize Bunting and follow on his every word. I have found reports that Harvey moved in with Bunting, but there were no stories on Bunting's previous wife, Tripp. I have also found sources that say that Elizabeth Harvey and Bunting got married. However, some sources say it was just an affair. This is the part of the story I've tried to research, but I cannot confirm 100% right now. In December 1995, an argument between a male and a female take place. The male is Ray Davis, an intellectually disabled man who is living in a caravan. The female is Suzanne Allen, who is reported to be Davis's landlord of the caravan and also former lover. The argument is over accusations that Davis had sexually assaulted Allen's grandsons. Allen goes on to report it to the police, but also in a fit of rage, vents her frustration and tells her neighbour. Her neighbour is Bunting. Bunting heard all he needed to hear. Bunting contacts Wagner and they both go and find Davis. They overpower him and bound him. They take Davis to a bushland area where they beat him. They later return to Bunting's house with Davis still alive, where Elizabeth Harvey is also waiting. The 3 tortured him and strangled him to death with jumper leads. They all then take Davis's body to the backyard of Bunting's Waterloo home and bury him. Ray Davis seemed to have been a loner. No one went looking for him or reported him missing. Just under a year had passed and Suzanne Allen became obsessed with Bunting. They started a relationship, and this was all going on while Bunting was still married and also having another affair. However, Bunting didn't see anything with Allen. In fact, the constant contact he would have with Allen became irritating to Bunting. And one day, Allen disappeared. Her family reports her missing and police head to her house. However, no one was home. The home was a mess and the pets were without food. What police didn't know is that Allen's body was also in the backyard of Bunting's Waterloo home. She was dismembered and put into several plastic bags. When Bunting was eventually caught, he admitted to dismembering her and burying her, but not killing her. Bunting said that he just wanted to get her pension and that she died of a heart attack. Shockingly, there was not enough evidence to tie Bunting and the gang to the murder. In the same year of 1996, Bunting, Elizabeth Harvey and her 2 sons moved to Murray Bridge, about 100 kilometers away from his old place in Waterloo. And it seems at this point, Bunting now has an agenda. He has a chart set up in his room named the Rock Spider Wall. A rock spider is an Australian slang for pedophiles. On this chart, he has a list of acquaintances that he believes could be known pedophiles. He would randomly call up anyone who was on his list and abuse them through the phone. In 1997, a 19-year-old man by the name of Michael Gardner would rent a house with his friends not too far from Robert Wagner. Michael Gardner was an openly gay man who also had a terrible past. His father would disapprove of his homosexuality and was reportedly to be sexually abused by a family friend. Gardner's landlord happens to be cousins with a woman who is seeing Wagner. Her name is Vicky Mills, and this is how Gardner and Wagner meet. One day, Wagner and Mills come to find Gardner is playing with one of Mills's children. Though not sexual, Wagner and Mills disapproved of Gardner's way of playing with Mills's child. This sparked outrage. Wagner contacts Bunting and they plan to take out Gardner. In August 1997, Bunting and Wagner abduct Gardner, torture and kill him at Bunting's house in Murray Bridge. Bunting and Wagner cut up Gardner and put his remains in an acid barrel in his backyard. During this time, Barry Lane and Robert Wagner have broken up, and Lane has a new partner in Thomas Trevelyan. Trevelyan was a person who was reported to have psychiatric problems. He was a paranoid schizophrenic and believed the Grim Reaper was going to kill him. This is a little important to the story later on. Trevelyan and Lane started to share a house together from April until October 1997, and during that time, Bunting started to befriend Trevelyan. The reason why Lane wasn't a victim earlier is that he was Wagner's partner, and also Bunting thought that Lane could lead him to more victims, but now that's over. It's also gotten back to Bunting that Lane has been telling other people about the first murder with Trezise, and this is enough for Bunting to go after Lane. In October 1997, Bunting, Wagner, and Trevelyan went to Lane's house. They tortured him and forced Lane to make a call to his mother saying that he wanted nothing else to do with her and that he was moving to Queensland, Australia. They got his financial details and then strangled him to death. Like Gardner's body, he was dismembered and put into a barrel. Because of the phone call to his mother, the police had no reason to investigate at that time. After the murder of Lane, Trevelyan needs a new place to stay. He moves in with Wagner, a move that he would soon regret. Trevelyan is already mentally unstable and feels somewhat guilty about murdering Lane. Bunting and Wagner don't trust Trevelyan and think he might rat them out. He becomes emotional and erratic about what's happened. So, on November 5th, 1997, Bunting and Wagner drive Trevelyan to Kensbrook in the Adelaide Hills. There, they stage a hanging. His body was found on the same day, and because of his history of mental illness, it was concluded that he took his own life. At this point, Bunting seemed to ignore his initial reasoning for killing people, his hatred for homosexuals and pedophiles, then moved on to drug addicts. This was unfortunate for Gavin Porter. In 1998, Porter became friends with Flasakis. Porter was a heroin addict. Bunting called Porter a waste and grew a strong hatred towards him. One day, Bunting sits down on his couch and pricks himself with a needle that was left behind by Porter. He instantly went into a rage and there decides Porter's days are numbered. In April 1998, while Porter was sleeping in his car, Bunting and Wagner beat, torture, and murder Porter. They store his body in another barrel in the backyard of Bunting's house in Murray Bridge. Flasakis at this point was not involved in the murders, but all that was going to change. He was repulsed when Bunting brought him to the shed and showed him his dirty work. Scared for his life, Flasakis helped gain access to Porter's government payments. Around August 1998, Bunting thought it was time for Flasakis to get his hands dirty. As I mentioned earlier, Troy Yude, Flasakis' older half-brother, sexually abused him when they were young. Bunting thinks this is a good excuse to kill Yude. And on the 21st of November 1998, Bunting, Wagner and Flasakis go into Yude's room. It was reported that Bunting and Wagner did most of the killing. However, Vlasakis helped dispose of the body in the back shed in the Murray Bridge residency. The murders went from pedophiles to homosexuals to drug addicts, and now to easy targets. The next victim happened to be the nephew of a woman in the same social group as Bunting. That woman's name was Elizabeth Hayden, and she was married to Mark Hayden, another person who would become another key face in these crimes. Reports are vague, but it's said that Mark had already been helping out with the storage of bodies. Bodies were moved to his house and eventually to a disused bank that Mark Hayden was renting. It was while hanging out, Bunting would meet Elizabeth's nephew, Frederick Brooks. Frederick was an intellectually disabled young man, so Bunting saw him as an easy target. Just around a month after Troy Ude's murder, Bunting invites Frederick over to his house. There, Wagner and Vlasakis were also waiting for him. The helpless Frederick was tortured. The torture techniques seemed to have gotten more sadistic as the victim count rose. Frederick was subjected to burns, beatings, and electrocution. The gang even inserted a sparkler into his genitals and set it alight. Bunting, Wagner, and Vlasakis took Frederick's body to Mark Hayden's house. This is where they stored his body, and at this point also moved 3 other barrels to the same property. The next victim, Gary O'Dwyer, has conflicting reports of how he ended up knowing Bunting. Some reports say he was the neighbor of Bunting and Vlasakis. Some reports say he was a stranger. Other reports say that while Bunting and Vlasakis were sitting in the car, O'Dwyer passed them and saw him as an easy target. Whichever way, Gary O'Dwyer, a disabled man due to a car accident, was on Bunting's radar. In November 1998, O'Dwyer manages to get close enough to Bunting, Wagner and Vlasakis, and he invites the 3 over to his house on Francis Street. They disguise the social meeting as just a few drinks and a chat, but Bunting, Wagner and Vlasakis go on to beat him, tie him up, and torture him. They gathered financial information and then strangled him to death. They dismembered him and then stored him in a barrel. The next gang's victim was Elizabeth Hayden, the wife of Mark Hayden. There are reports to suggest that Elizabeth Hayden, though married, was also interested in Bunting. Despite the influence on the case, there is not much reported on Elizabeth Hayden's murder, but it is because of this case that police start to close in on the gang. The gang's last victim was Vlasakis' stepbrother, David Johnson. On the 9th of May 1999, Vlasakis took Johnson to the disused bank in Snowtown rented by Mark Hayden. David Johnson was neither a homosexual, a pedophile, nor a person with a disability that the gang could take advantage of. However, reports say that Bunting told the rest of the gang that Johnson needed to die. After entering the disused bank with Vlasakis, Bunting and Wagner ambushed him. They handcuffed him, beat him, retrieved his personal information, and killed him. However, the last victim is where Bunting and Wagner would become even sicker. Reports say that they dismembered him, fried parts of Johnson's body up, and then ate them. Though the bodies of the first victims, Clinton Trezise and later Thomas Trevelyan, were found, they were not connected to Bunting and the gang. As I mentioned before, the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden was what started the police investigation connected with the gang. It's reported that Elizabeth's brother reported her missing. When Elizabeth's brother asked Mark Hayden about her disappearance, his story didn't seem to check out. Police were also curious why Mark Hayden himself wouldn't report his wife going missing as well. This eventually led to the infamous disused bank that Mark Hayden rented in Snowtown. On the 20th of May 1999, 11 days after the gang's last victim, police entered the disused bank. Inside the bank vault, 6 plastic barrels were found amongst the disgusting scent that filled the bank. The evidence led police to arrest Bunting, Wagner, Vlasakis, and Hayden on the 21st of May 1999. In December 2003, Bunting was convicted of committing 11 murders. Life in prison with no parole. Wagner, 10 murders, however, only confessing to 3 and received life in prison with no parole. Vlasakis was charged with 4 murders, life in prison with a non-parole period of 26 years. And Hayden, 5 counts of assisting the murders, sentenced to 25 years with a non-parole period of 18 years. They were finally behind bars. Though the victims were the main people who suffered, citizens of the small town of Snowtown were also affected. The community of Snowtown have been affected so much by these horrendous crimes that there have been talks of changing the name. This is still ongoing. This was by far the most draining story I've covered so far. The amount of people involved, the timelines, the details of the murders were all tiring. However, what did you think of the story? Thank you for listening and watching. Remember to help the channel by liking and subscribing, and we'll see you next time.